Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Today's video is going to be all about DI guitars and what you can do with little to no money from home to improve your DI guitars. Tip number one is to make sure your guitar is in tune. That might sound a little obvious, but you'd be surprised how often that recordings just don't sound as good as they could because the guitars are out of tune. If you don't have a tuner, you can pick one up pretty cheap online, probably used. You can also probably find a tuner in the DAW that you're using to record. So in Logic, I have a little tuner right up here near the top. If you don't have this, you might need to go into Customize Control Bar and Display, and over here on the right side, find Tuner. Just check the box to add it. This will really help give that extra level of detail and polish to your guitars. Any commercially recorded and released song, the guitars are in tune, I guarantee it. One thing to note when you're tuning, I like to tune just a little bit flat, and I mean like less than 10 cents flat, so maybe like 5 cents flat. Reason being, there's so many things you can do when you're playing the guitar to accidentally make it go sharp. For example, if you press the strings a little too hard, you're going to pull sharp. Your intonation could be off and pull you sharp. If you're bending at all or doing any sort of vibrato, it's better to be flat. So when you pull sharp, you're closer to pitch rather than being on pitch or sharp. And then when you pull sharp, you're really sharp. Aggressive strumming and playing as well as down tuning can also cause you to pull sharp. So just watch out for those. Tip number two, make sure you play in time. And so this means make sure your metronome's on, make sure you lock in with the drums, even your feel, like your push-pull, you want to be right in the pocket. Easier said than done. This takes a lot of practice to make sure you're playing in time, but in the long run, it's really going to make your recordings sound that much better. Say you're a little new to telling if something's in time or not. An easy way to check is to go into your session and zoom in on the waveforms of your guitars. And you can actually see when things are hitting relative to the beat. So if I put my playhead right here on measure 5, you can see everything that's happening at that point. So it's not perfect, but it's definitely close. And that's the beauty of guitars, is they're not perfect. They're human instruments. And so you want to get as close as you can without completely cutting and aligning things mechanically. Tip number 3 is to make sure you're recording at the proper input level. So that means on your interface or in your DAW, wherever you're monitoring your input gain, you want your input to be reaching close to -12. Ideally between -12 and -18. You can also go as high up to -6 as you want. The reason this is so important, especially for guitars when you're going to hit an amp sim within your DAW or later in the chain, is that these amp sims are made to respond and distort to a certain input level. And so when you exceed that input level or you're a lot below that input level, you're actually interfering with how the amp is meant to react to the input signal. And so that's just something to keep in mind. If you're like strumming chords and it sounds way too overdriven, you're like, why is this Fender amp sim overdriving so much? It might be that your input gain is too hot. The next tip to watch out for is your strings ringing out when you don't want them to. I see this a lot in beginner and intermediate players when they're recording. Is they'll strum and change notes and stuff, but other notes like the low E or high E, random strings are ringing out when they're not supposed to be. And even if it's something really quiet and almost indetectable, as soon as you hit a really overdriven amp, that's going to start to add noise and these weird overtones, undertones, all this other stuff. Even if you can't detect it on one track, over all your tracks in your song, it's going to start to add up and just create noise and yuckiness, for lack of a better term. There's a few things you can do. The free way is to practice and get better. I know that's probably not what you wanted to hear coming into this video. Without me going too deep into it, there's ways that you can position your hand and your fingers to mute strings that shouldn't be ringing when you're not playing them. That's a whole nother video. So if you have questions about that, just look it up on YouTube. I'm sure someone's talked about it. So I have this little cloth right here. It's just like a little white piece of fabric. And I'll actually weave this in between my strings if I'm playing a lead line and having trouble muting it. Just kind of tuck it in between each string. Something like this will work. You can literally like cut off a piece of a t-shirt. That's a free option for you. They also sell these little like Velcro things that you can put on your neck, and that'll do the same thing. Again, that costs like, I don't know, 10, 15 bucks. Few options depending on if you want to spend something or nothing, but definitely it's important to get rid of those sounds and those things making that noise. I've written a little 8-bar song that I'm going to use as an example of guitar production throughout this video. So I've got this main lead guitar line, like the high part. I recorded it once clean with no strings ringing out, and then I recorded it again with strings ringing out and all the dirt and that kind of stuff. so you can hear the difference. Here's the clean one. And here's the one with the strings ringing out. So you can hear that dramatically changes how the guitar feels and just the overall tightness and professionalism of the take. So now that we've got all that kind of utility, basic stuff out of the way, we can start talking about more creative things that help improve your guitars. And the first thing is to double track everything. Double tracking means you're going to play the same exact part twice. You can use the same guitar, you can use a different guitar. That's up to you. Experiment and see what you like. But you're going to want to record the same exact part the same exact way 2 times. The reason this is important is for something called panning. If you're not familiar with panning, that's kind of where you're going to hear something left or right. In Logic, the pan knob is right here. So when you're right up in the middle, that means center. You're going to hear it equally in both ears. And then as you turn to one side or the other, you're actually going to only hear it in one side or the other. And this is an old technique, probably since like 70s or 80s. It's really popular in like rock songs and that kind of thing, where you double track your guitar, you play it the same way twice, and then you hard pan them. Doesn't necessarily need to be hard panned, but panned opposite. I'm going to use my main rhythm guitars as an example here. So here's with the double track in there. They're both panned in the middle right now, and I'll pan them out in a second. So here is with them hard panned. It's like a lot more bigness and width. If you haven't been utilizing that, it's definitely a good practice to do that. Most commercial recordings are double tracking. There's times when you wouldn't want to do this, but I like to decide that in the mixing phase. And so when I have the guitar set up and I'm in that creative mode, I just go ahead and get 2 takes of everything. Every part, 2 takes. And then you can decide later if you want to hard pan them or have the double track in there. That's up to you. You have them. You don't have to worry about it. The next tip is to use a good amp sim. If you haven't heard that term before, amp sim is like amp simulator. If you're not physically miking an amp and recording that into your DAW, you need something along the line that is going to give it that amp sound. Otherwise, it's going to sound like this. That's not great. So when you add an amp sim, then you suddenly get that amp sound. For the purpose of this video so far, I've just been using the stock amp sim in Logic. So there's free amp sim plugins out there, but I just prefer Helix. It's a whole ecosystem and environment, and it's all there for me. I'm not sure what the price is currently. It might depend on if you have Helix hardware or not. However, it's something to consider. There's free options out there, there's paid options, but definitely look around and find an amp sim that you like. So a good amp sim is going to have a few things. It'll have like drive level, your EQs like mid, bass, treble, probably a presence, channel volume, lots of different stuff like this. This is going to lead me into my next point, which is pay attention to all the virtual mics and placements. A lot of amp sims come with these, and you shouldn't ignore them. They're a tool to help you get the tone you want. So in Helix Native, they have a cab plugin where you can actually see the speaker. You can change the mic sim that's on it. You can change the degree, like whether it's straight or off axis. And you can even change the position of the mic. And this is really important because one thing I had trouble with when I switched from miking a real amp to amp sims, and it's one of the things that kept me from switching for a while, was that I like to point the mic and like move it around and get the exact right spot. Because if you're at the center of the cone, it's going to be really bright. And as you move out to the edge, it gets darker and warmer. And then if you pull it away, you lose low end. And so there's a lot you can do physically with the mic to change the tone. And so when I first started using amp sims, I really missed that until I started digging in and finding this kind of stuff. My next tip for you is to use lots of layers. And specifically when you're using overdriven guitars, overdrive can kind of add up over multiple channels. So if you dial in a guitar tone with lots of overdrive and you're like, this is perfect, this is how I want it to sound, once you add in lots of layers, like do your double tracking for everything, add a lead over top of that, some sort of ambient thing, it's actually going to get too distorted and you're going to lose clarity. So you actually want to lean on the side of not as distorted. And instead rely on layers to add your bigness. So for my rhythm guitars, I did 2 different passes, each one double tracked. So my first one is kind of an open version of the chords. And then I added in a bar chord version of the chords as well. And now nothing's that overdriven by itself, but once I add those together, it really starts to thicken up and add that kind of overdrive that you're wanting to hear. This next tip is from more of a mixing standpoint. When I was trying to learn how to mix amp sims versus a mic'd up amp, I kind of had trouble because I wasn't sure like how to process it. You have to think of it in a sense that like your amp sim, in a physical recording chain, your amp sim is going to be like your input, your preamp of the amp, the cab, the mic on the cab, all of those things are being taken care of in the one amp sim plugin. And so the very next thing that mic is going to hit would be a preamp, like a console style preamp. And so from there, I would just mix it like I normally would with like virtual mix rack. So first I'd put in like a virtual console with like with an API sound. And then I'd put this API EQ and then like the LA2A and just mix it straight up exactly how you would if it was a mic'd guitar. And then the final tip is to send all your guitars to a room reverb, because one thing you're gonna kind of feel is lacking from not micing a regular amp is the mic picking up the sound of the amp in the room ever so slightly. All these guitars are really dry because they're all amp sims, and the Logic amp sim doesn't have any like room ambience to add in. Some amp sims do, and those are awesome, but a lot of the time they don't. So I'm gonna highlight all these guitars and send them Villa Bathroom. We'll just use that as an example, but you just want to send like a little bit in there. That's just going to give it that extra little bit of liveliness and fullness that you would have picked up from a 57 on a cab that is kind of lacking from these amp sims. So that's all the tips I have for this video on professional sounding DI guitars. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. Also, please make sure you like and subscribe so you'll be notified when I release more content like this. Thanks again for watching.